listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. Today, I am joined by Sam Brake Guia. He's the co-founder of Podwritten, and he is a returning guest. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Always lovely to have another podcast interview conversation with you, Heather.
Yeah, you too. And you're globetrotting. So you're all over the world and you're enjoying some time in Malaysia right now, it sounds like. That's really very cool that you've been able to run the company and travel as well. How is everything going at Podwritten?
Yeah, it's fantastic. We are having a wonderful time running and scaling our business, Podwritten. My wife and I, we run it together. Like you mentioned, we're digital nomads, so we're traveling the world. We're currently in Malaysia, and we do this full time, and it's fantastic. My wife and I, we love working specifically in the health and wellness space. Those are the professionals and businesses that we help. It's something we're passionate about because we run marathons, we work out, we do jujitsu, Muay Thai. We're super fit, super active, and we love the health and wellness space. So we love helping others in this space promote their message, their business, and grow through podcast guesting.
Mm-hmm. So we find that in podcast advertising, there are a lot of supplement companies in particular that really want to get into the space and run a lot of ads in the space. Obviously, AG1 is kind of a pioneer. Do you feel like health and wellness companies kind of gravitate toward podcasts? And is there a specific reason for that?
I would say so. I think it's because podcasting, as you know, has a great deal of trust, and people really trust podcasters. And when it comes to health and wellness, there's so much misinformation out there that I think that people really have this affinity with the host that they listen to. They're like, I trust this person does the research, this person speaks my language. If this person recommends something, then I'm probably going to want to like buy AG1 or something along those lines. And also one of the reasons that we work in health and wellness, specifically in podcasting, is because the market is huge. There are so many health and wellness
Mhm.
podcasts out there about so many subjects. And I'm not just talking about health and wellness in a physical sense, but we work with a lot of relationship therapists and we work with a lot of parenting podcasts. And we have such a wide spectrum that it's not just like physical wellness, but mental wellness as well. And these are difficult times. I mean, I'm sure the world is always a chaotic place and has always been, but I mean, there's lots of reasons that you would want to take better care of your health or take better care of your mental health. And I think people turn to podcasts for that free support often. And then when they want to take that further with something paid or service or a product, then certainly they're going to think of the last podcast advert that they heard or the last endorsement from the host. And that's why it's really popular space for health and wellness.
Yeah, yeah, I think it makes total sense. We talk obviously so much on the show about podcast advertising. We're talking about how to create campaigns that are really successful. And we often at True Native Media will work with brands that have never been in the space before and they're interested in placing ads, which is great. But I do feel like there are always a few different lanes that you can take to get involved in podcasting. Obviously, you can buy ads. I think sometimes people feel like they have to start their own show, which is fine. If a brand's interested in doing a branded show, I think that's great. But guesting is certainly something that is an important part of entering the podcast space. And in many instances, it doesn't even really cost anything. So, talk to us a little bit about how you see brands getting involved and how can they utilize guesting?
Yeah, so I think this is particularly useful when there's someone in the brand who really is the brand ambassador. Maybe they're the
Mm,
founder, or maybe they're someone that is very core to the mission of the company. And it's excellent because they can go on to shows and be exactly that, a brand ambassador, somewhat a face to the company, a personality to the company. They can speak passionately about like what drives the company and why this is a brand worth recognizing and working with or purchasing from. And I think that this is a really great opportunity for brands to inject some personality. So it's not just like ads are great, obviously, and we know that they work really well in podcasting, but we also know that being a guest on a podcast really works because you get a full, usually like 30, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour or more conversation. And we also know that there's data around this. Buzzsprout has previously released data that the average podcast listener consumes about 80% of a podcast. And even if it wasn't close to that number, it's still staggeringly high compared to almost all media out there. So we know that podcast consumers are willing to consume and listen in for a really long time and give quite a lot of their attention, especially when you think about like the fact that an Instagram reel on average is viewed for 3 seconds. So the fact that you're getting like often half an hour or more of someone's full attention, and you can explain your story, your motivation, what sets you apart, you get this opportunity to really connect with the listener and be entrenched in their memory for a long time to come. So that's where I see it really fitting in for brands in this space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love all those statistics that you just listed about podcasts. I just sometimes I am amazed at how much time is really spent with podcasts and how little we talk about it. Because
Mhm.
when you compare it to other platforms, the time spent with podcasts is staggeringly high. And it really makes such a big difference. I think, especially when it's a 30-minute commercial in a lot of senses, it
Yeah.
is much better than a commercial because it's not a commercial, it's an actual conversation. And I know that for myself, I will frequently listen to podcasts and enjoy the guests so much that I go and either buy their book or I go and see if they have their own podcast that I can listen to. And for me, when I like someone, I want more of what it is that they're creating and they're putting out there. And that could be for somebody that's just, an individual person and maybe they are their brand, or it could be for an entire brand and a company. Do you feel like there's a difference in effectiveness if it's just like an everyday person or an author as compared to an actual organization that is guesting on the show?
So it really depends, I suppose, on how prepared they turn up. Sometimes
Mhm.
at least in our experience, people turn up in all different stages because some people arrive, at least for us, and if they're an individual, they might have no experience at all. And this means like they've never had been on a podcast before. They don't have necessarily like a strong media background, in which case we bring them on and then we give them interview training, we help coach them, and we kind of really develop them from the ground up.
Mhm.
Whereas someone from a brand or established business, they might not necessarily have the same, they might need the same training. Maybe they haven't been on podcasts before, but at least with some kind of history or some kind of like stronger credibility, they can come in. They might have a blog, for example. A lot of brands have blogs, in which case we can kind of like point to that with some credibility. Or maybe the fact that they have a strong social media following. A lot of brands might have a big following, whereas like an individual might not always have a big following. So
Mhm.
I think that brands that come in sometimes come in like more prepared. It entirely depends on the individual. We have many individuals that come in, like we have one client, for example, he's an individual, Brian Keane, top personal trainer in Ireland. He's got 500,000 social media followers. So, I mean, that's bigger than a lot of brands that probably exist out there. But again, if you have a more defined business goal in line, which most brands will, most brands are going to be certain about what they want to do, what they want to achieve, what they want to get out of this. And then we can really tailor the ROI around that and be like, okay, you're clear on what you want to get. And we can definitely focus our strategy around achieving the ROI of your goals. Whereas someone that's individual might not always have the same strategy in mind because it's just them and they're like, oh, I just want to increase book sales, which is great. And that is a goal and we can help with that. But then they might not have like the other components, which in the background, like the newsletter or the email sequence or the other things which might help contribute to like nurturing people to buy that book. In which case, like we then give guidance and we can definitely like make suggestions on that to help set them up. But brands sometimes come in just overall more prepared. But
Mhm.
again, it really depends on the individual that's coming to us as well.
Sure. Yeah, no, that I think that makes a lot of sense. And I will say I've talked about this experience before on the show, I believe, but before I founded True Native Media, I was doing business coaching and I was on Entrepreneur on Fire and I was so unprepared and I didn't even realize how unprepared I was. I had guested on a handful of other shows that frankly were probably quite small and they really hadn't moved the needle. And then I got on Entrepreneur on Fire, which was amazing, but I didn't have a good call to action. I didn't have like a good landing page prepared. And I want to say we got something like 100+ inquiries for our services afterwards. And I was just so ill prepared that I really wasn't able to action on all of those prospective leads. And it was a real big missed opportunity for me. How often do you feel like that happens?
I think if they're not working with an agency like us to guide them or to prepare them, then a lot of people walk into podcast guesting thinking that. A lot of people, and this is one of the biggest errors I say, people go on and they just assume a couple of things. They assume that if they go on and they just list everywhere they are, oh, find me on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, you can get me on TikTok. They just list off everywhere. It's kind of like, well, which one is your main platform? Like, where am I going to find the real source of this information? Because few people are actually like posting everything all the time on all of these platforms. And there's kind of this like choice paralysis that takes place. Plus, people have this mentality that, oh, I'm going to go on a podcast and you're going to have, like you said, like Entrepreneurs on Fire is a big show. And I've heard many people go on there and they get that result. And the same is possible for a lot of podcasts. And we see that. But sometimes, like beforehand, you said you had been on some shows before. And from the sounds of it, they didn't necessarily bring the same yield as like Entrepreneurs on Fire. But again, they were probably smaller shows and you weren't as prepared with the CTA, and therefore like it's not going to gain the traction that you want. And people kind of have this expectation like every interview is going to result in Entrepreneurs on Fire. But if you really want to set yourself up for success and make sure that you get the most out of each one, then you do have to come prepared with a CTA. You have to kind of tease it throughout. You have to give a reason for listeners to really tune in and stick around to the end to get the freebie that you're giving away. It has to
Mhm.
be something of value that makes them stop what they're doing to go and get it. And then behind that, you also need to have like this nurture sequence to kind of encourage them to take the next step, maybe if they're not ready at that moment. Like I once had a client and she was giving a discount and she came to us being like, oh, I'm going to give a discount to my listeners when they buy this. And we were like, that's great. And absolutely. But I mean, they might not be in a place at the interview ready to make a purchase. So let's consider this. You can offer the discount, but also have a CTA, which is going to be more appealing for someone that's maybe just wants to learn a little bit more. And then we get them on the mailing list. And once they're on the mailing list, then you can offer the discount. And that's really kind of like these kind of strategies are maybe things that people don't always think about or aren't always aware of, and how they can be really, really strategic when it comes to their CTA and how they present themselves.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely spot on. One of the biggest obstacles, I think, in podcast guesting is just the pitch process.
Mm.
And it's been really interesting to me because we represent about 200 podcasts at True Native Media, and our mission is to sell ads on their podcasts. So we have nothing to do with guesting. And I get many pitches a day for people who want to guest on the shows that we represent. And number one, first off, it's annoying to me because it's not what I do and I have to filter through all of the emails. Number two, I am shocked at how poorly many of the pitches are. And in most cases, it's someone or a company that's hired a PR firm and they've just done such a bad job. I want to email the person and say, do you realize what a bad job this PR company is doing for you? They're really not doing you any favors here. But I guess talk to us a little bit about the pitching process and is are there different tips or tricks? Is there timing, seasonality? Like what does that look like?
hmm Yeah, there definitely are. And I also want to say, like, I completely feel your pain, Heather. I'm a podcast host, as you know, Mike's to Millions, of which you've been a guest multiple times. And I actually guest on podcasts. And as a result of that, I receive emails in my inbox being like, hey, I loved your feature on like this show. You gave such great insights. Would you be interested in being a guest on more shows? And then they list off like how their business helps people get booked on pod. They're basically offering the service that I was saying, we offer this. This is what we do. This is our core business. And they're basically trying to get us booked on podcasts themselves. And it's like, clearly you did not listen to anything or you have no idea what's going on because there is so
No,
much spam out there.
oh,
It's the
so
same thing.
much.
And I would say that's not the way to go. I mean, even if you do just spam out emails and you get results, you're not really understanding what the results are or what shows you're getting on.
Hmm.
And therefore, it's not really going to be aligned because when you do podcast guesting, it's much better to focus on quality over quantity. And the reason being is
Hmm.
because you want to get on shows which are actually going to move the needle, much like your Entrepreneurs on Fire feature. That was clearly a really aligned show, and it spoke to an audience that was a great fit because people were like, I want to work with Heather. So you really want to be intentional about the shows that you pursue.
Hmm.
And by doing that, you have to go through, select the shows, and go after them and pitch them with a quality like pitch, not something which is just copy and paste or spammed. And additionally, I think podcasts are kind of unique in the sense that maybe if you're going after media companies and publications, there's lots of people working there. They're all kind of behind a brand. It's kind of more like a business. But most podcasters are independent or at least have built the show themselves or at least have like pioneered it largely through their own focus and their own time, their own energy, and therefore they're quite protective of the audience they've built up as a result. And I think that you have to show that you've done the work of understanding their audience, understanding their message, understanding what they're looking for, and put that into your pitch and make
Hmm.
that clear from the very start and throughout. And you can't do that if you're just spamming out emails. And I think that personal touch is super important. You asked about the seasonality or at least timing.
Yeah.
So one thing to consider when you send out pitches is like when is it arriving in the host inbox? Because if you're just going to send out a pitch and they're in Australia and you're in Florida and you send it out at like 9 a.m. your time, it's going to be like potentially like 10 p.m. their time. Um, which means it's by the time they get to the inbox tomorrow, it's probably buried under a load of stuff and they're not really going to get to it. So you want to make sure that you're sending out a pitch at 9 a.m. Ideally, we suggest on a Tuesday or a Thursday on the host's time, because those are days which they're more likely to have the time and focus.
Mm.
So try and align it for that. As well, you think about your follow-ups. You want to make, we usually suggest giving a week in between each follow-up you send, and we send two follow-ups. And we find that it works really well. We find that on average, 33% of our bookings come after a second follow-up. And we find that on average, a booking takes 14 days to get a response from a host. And in that time, we sent like two pitches almost. So the second pitch, this not the second pitch, follow-ups. So we send two follow-ups. We send the first pitch. A week later, or 6 days later, we send the first follow-up. And then another week later, we send the second follow-up. And we also find that about 15% of pitches come from a second follow-up. Um, so definitely like our strategy works in the sense that we are getting yeses after sending our follow-ups, but also I think it's important not to overdo it because one
Hmm.
thing you probably found from a lot of those people that are pitching you is that they will follow up like viciously.
Hmm.
I often get like a pitch within less than 24 hours of follow-up, and then like two more follow-ups within the next 48 hours, and then another follow-up like 3 days later, and another follow-up. And I understand there's like a whole sales strategy around this, and I'm sure there's probably data that this works because people are using it. But at the same time, do you really want to like piss off the person that you're trying to go after. And
Right.
one thing that I'll say as well is I see a lot of the time these agencies that do send this out, they don't send it out from their own email. They create emails because they know that people are going to get annoyed and they're going to block them, they're going to report them as spam, and then they just move on. If you want to protect your email address and you want to protect your own credibility, I don't think it's wise to take that approach because if you just follow up and you're not conscious about how you follow up people, you're going to give off the wrong impression. You're potentially going to get your inbox flagged. Um, and then when it comes to pitching around the year, one thing to consider is that podcast hosts take time off. Sometimes during summer, they might take time off. And over the Christmas period as well, the holiday season of December. So try to remember that if you're going to do a big sprint on pitches, if you're like, I'm going to get myself booked on shows, I'm going to get myself booked on so many podcasts, and you send pitches out during these times and you maybe don't see the response that you would hope for. Yes, maybe there could be improvements to your pitches that could be made, and maybe there's something else, but it's also worth bearing in mind that this is a slower season and you might not, it could be impacted because of that. So I think that's really important to consider.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think all of those things are very important. One of the things that we have talked about that I think is important, and when I say talked about, I mean like as an industry, we've talked about it. We've talked about it some on the show, but I'm finding that there are kind of conflicting opinions around interview-based shows. I think that some people say they're super overdone. We really don't need any more interview-based shows. And then there's a whole group of other people who say, no, interview-based shows are great. Like, let's do more of those. Where do you fall on that? I mean, obviously, you like interview-based shows since you have a business pitching guests, but like, what is your opinion about where we're at as an industry with interview-based shows?
So I think, yeah, there are a lot out there, and that obviously like is one of the reasons why our business is so successful because there's so many shows
Mhm,
to get people featured on in so many topics. I also think that I don't think that the interview is dead because people want it. Like there's a huge demand for it. People want to hear people
mhm,
speaking, people want to hear this interview style. I think when people say that the interview style is dead, I don't think that they're necessarily saying like it doesn't work. What I think is like it's a format that's overdone because people want something like podcasts that thrive. We know they kind of do something different and they kind of like a bit unique in that sense.
mhm,
But I think you can still be an interview podcast and still succeed. For example, on my show, Maximilians, I interview people. I love the one-on-one conversation. Like when you come on, we just have a chit chat about a subject like selling podcasts or podcast advertising, and you delivered fantastic insights. And these kind of episodes are really well received by my audience. But one thing that I do, and which works really well, is that I then do solo episodes where I basically talk about a subject and I'll cut up lots of clips from past hosts. So I'll talk about a topic and then I'll be like, here's what Heather Osgood had to say about what you should know about seeking sponsors or for defining relationships with sponsors. Then I'll be like, here's another host who got an ROI of like 100% from having sponsors on their show. And I kind of break it up. I like repurpose this content. And those episodes do really well. And we often see that like good shows, creative shows will find a way of repurposing their content. Maybe if they do interviews, they might turn it into a blog or they might like repurpose it into like a really like interesting breakdown in a newsletter. So I think even if the interview is in a like that's the format of the show predominantly, there's
mhm.
still really creative ways that people can then turn that into other content that makes it so much more valuable. So there's a lot of potential with repurposing there within the podcast and outside of it. And I also think that like, yeah, definitely interview shows are still super in demand in that sense.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I agree. I mean, I love interview shows and I enjoy listening to an expert. So if somebody is very knowledgeable and they can talk about their subject matter, and I agree also, I think that it's super helpful for you to do solo episodes and interview-based shows. So even if you're doing interview-based shows primarily, I think sprinkling in a solo show every now and then is helpful because the reality is that while people are coming to listen to your guest, they're coming for you primarily. And if you've got a great guest, I think that that's icing on the cake. I don't necessarily think your guest should be your cake. And
Mhm.
I feel like that's where people get it wrong sometimes. One of the things I've seen over and over and over again in my career is that podcasters will reach out to us and say, we've got this big person coming on the show. This episode's going to be amazing. And the guest is big. And number one, people always think that if they get this really amazing guest on their show, that that person is going to share it everywhere. But the reality is that when you have someone semi-famous or famous on your show, they don't share it everywhere because they have lots of things to share and your interview with them isn't all that exciting oftentimes, right? And
Mhm.
I have been surprised at how frequently those interviews really can fall flat. And it's not that they detract from the show at all, but often they're not giving what the host thinks will actually result. And so I think it's really important to establish yourself as the voice of your show. And then as you're having guests on the show, yes, you want to have a great conversation. And I love the interview format. But I do think that it's really important to establish yourself as the voice.
hmm I
Yeah.
think that as well, I completely agree with you, and that's why solo episodes are great. And I love doing solo episodes, and I also love adding these little clips in because it just breaks them up a bit and gives a bit more
Yeah.
like strengthens the points that I'm trying to make. But when it comes to interviews, I think that you can still be a guest on shows and not necessarily follow the interview format that is so common. An example of that is we work with a client, and she is based in Australia.
Mm.
And usually we've got a couple clients in Australia, and we're able to make it work with hosts in the US, and that's not a problem. On one occasion, one host just like couldn't make things work, but she said, "You know what? Why don't you just send?" What I usually do is I break up my interviews and I like give narration in between the points. She was like, "Why don't you just send over the points? Like, I'm going to send you the
Mm.
questions, you record it, and we'll send it over." So we were like, "Great." So what how it worked in the end was she sent over the questions, and we ended up having the podcast interview with our client, and we were like hosting, and we were like asking the questions. And then what we did is we just went in, we like professionally cut out her questions and we cleaned it up a bit and we like handed over answers as an MP3 to each of
Mhm.
her questions and we sent it over and it worked really well. And I feel that this is something that I've been doing as well with some guests. I do episodes, much like my solo episodes, but instead of past features that I'm mentioning, I reach out to people and I'm like, hey, can you send me a quick clip on, with your thoughts on this? So I think that it's still possible to have this interview style without actually just the usual regular kind of like let's jump on a call and chat.
Right.
There are creative ways of doing this.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Well, Sam, I know we need to start wrapping it up, but I'm curious before we do that. You've been working in the industry for several years now, and you certainly have seen trends. Talk to us about like how maybe have things changed or what trends have you seen around kind of, booking and guesting?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm constantly seeing this space growing.
Mm,
And by that, I mean, like, there are so many podcasts out there, there are so many niches out there, which is fantastic. But also, there is a lot of competition in this space in the sense there are so many more podcast guest booking agencies. Fortunately, we're still the one that's focused specifically on health and wellness, so we stand out in that space. But there are so many other agencies out there that are doing this, and there's a lot of people pitching. So I think now more than ever, it's important to have that quality in your work. I think it's really important to have that quality in your pitches because you can still stand out. Like we have a fantastic network here at Podwritten that we've established, but we still do a lot of cold pitches because cold pitches work. I think I even seen like you speak about this on LinkedIn before about like cold pitching still
mhm,
works if it's
it
done
does.
well. And yeah, I think if you really put quality into your pitches, then you can figure out how to do that. I do have a gift for your listeners, which can help them if they are choosing to go down that path of pitching themselves. If they go to podwritten.com/links, then I've got a free guide that they can download, and it will help them get booked as a podcast guest in 4 weeks. And if you put that quality into your pitches, then you're going to see results. Even if this space has become more crowded and more competitive, there's so many opportunities out there. So that would be the main thing that I would say that I've seen, just the increase.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, and just to piggyback off of that, I really do think that, as you mentioned, quality over quantity is important. And there are so many shows out there. What I typically recommend, especially we typically are working with the podcaster who's like, hey, how do I grow my audience? And guesting on other shows is a great way to grow your audience. But what I tell people is, if you're a host, obviously you shouldn't be super nervous or concerned about starting. But as you're starting, pick shows that you know are smaller, or maybe the host is less experienced, because you can just get some, experience and get some miles under your feet, knowing kind of, well, how does this process work? And each person's going to be slightly different about how they want to structure the interview, but you can get more confident in your ability to speak. Make sure you've got a nice enough mic or a nice enough setup, those sorts of things. So I think that that's good to start on the smaller end and then work your way up. But it really, obviously we've already talked about the Entrepreneur on Fire example, but it makes such a huge difference if you can get on really quality shows, because the larger the audience and the more well targeted the content is to your specific demographic, that's going to make such a huge difference in your ability to convert. So you could get on 10 shows that are really of very little consequence, and you could get on one show that could move the needle dramatically. So it really does make such a big difference to be able to identify those shows. And I'm sure working with a service like yours, you are able to say, this show is a big show and this would be a huge win. And then you have that ability to spend the time and effort to tailor your pitch to that show instead of doing the spray and pray method. Because ultimately, what you're looking for is not the quantity of interviews you're doing, but the impact that you're able to have with really kind of superior interviews on more impactful shows.
hmm Yeah, we see that absolutely. So a client we work with, EJ and Tara Kerwin, they're the hosts of Relationship Renovation. We've booked them on a ton of interviews. We've been working with them for the past year or so, and we booked them on lots and lots of shows. And many of those shows are really big. Like I'm talking in the listen notes score, they're like ranked in the top 0.5% of shows. So they get 10,000, listeners. But surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, one of their biggest results came from a relatively small show, a top 1% ranked show. So far from their biggest result, but that brought in multiple clients, and that was incredibly successful. And the reason being is because they are a therapist, they're a therapist couple. They're also a blended family, and that's not always a big part of their message because like they're mostly focusing about couples. But we booked them on a show which was Blended Family Breakthrough, which is a podcast specifically about being a blended family. And that was super targeted to like a niche that they could speak to accurately and deliver quality advice. And yeah, that was an incredibly successful interview, and they actually developed a really good relationship with the host and had the host on, and they got multiple clients from that interview, as I mentioned. So I think like when most people are going on podcast guesting, they're like, I want to be on Mel Robbins, I want to be on Andrew Huberman, I want to be on
Right.
like the top shows. And most people don't realize that like if your goal is to make money, then you can achieve that by going on shows to before you get to that level of being on those top shows. you can go after shows which are really going to provide an ROI for your
Right.
podcast guesting endeavors, and you
Yeah.
shouldn't overlook those.
Right. Well, I think you're spot on, which I mean, really, it's that middle market, right? And I think even like some of those bigger shows, they're just so packed full that it
Hmm.
does feel sometimes difficult to stand out, right? And I mean, if you're standing next to Mel Robbins, she's going to overshadow you always, right? Because she's Mel Robbins, where if you're able to get on those middle shows, they're ones that have really nice established audience. The audiences are big enough, but also it's going to feel more authentic, I think, which also ultimately helps with conversion because at the end of the day, you're really just trying to build relationships. And it's through this conversation that's amplified that you're doing that relationship building.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that people just should not overlook those podcasts just because they're maybe smaller,
Mhm.
and they should realize that there's so much value there. And don't be don't be like, I'm gonna go podcast guesting, let's go straight for the big shows. That's probably like a mistake. We see a lot of people that come to us, then we have to kind of like re-educate them, like, no, we have a strategy in place, this strategy works, like we're going to work our way up to those shows. Or even if they are at a place where they're like ready to go for those, we're like still like there's so much like low-hanging fruit with these other shows, let's go for that, and let's make sure we're not leaving anything on the table.
Right, right. No, absolutely. Well, Sam, why don't you give us that link one more time if someone wants to download that guide, where can they find it?
Yeah, so it's podwritten.com/links. And on that page, you'll also see options for other freebies as well and links to connect with me. The best place to keep up with what I'm doing is LinkedIn. And I have a podcast, Mike's to Millions, which is where I speak with experts like Heather. You can check out her 2 episodes. And I also speak with top 1% ranked podcast hosts in the health and wellness space to help health and wellness podcasters understand how they can grow and monetize their shows.
Awesome. Well, Sam, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, Heather.
Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you have never done any guesting, I highly encourage you to do it. It is a ton of fun and does produce great results. Thanks for listening and watching, and we will catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.